Winter's bitter winds howl across the Montana wilderness, where a young pregnant widow stumbles through deepening snow. Her late husband's family has cast her out, leaving her with nothing but a thin shawl and the child growing within her. Miles from anywhere, her strength failing, she collapses near a remote cabin. Inside, a lone cowboy tends his fire, unaware that fate has brought him a chance at redemption. 3 years ago, he lost his own wife and child, and since then he's lived in self-imposed solitude. When he finds her half frozen on his land, something long dormant stirs in his heart. As he carries her to safety, neither realizes that this night will change both their lives forever. Could these two broken souls, each bearing deep wounds of loss, find healing in each other's company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah clutched Thomas's pocket watch as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, the cold metal against her palm, a final reminder of the life she'd lost. Just hours ago, she'd been sitting in what she thought was her home, the grandfather clock inn, the corner marking time as her in-laws delivered their verdict. "You weren't even married a full year," Margaret had said, her voice sharp as an icicle. "The ranch belongs to the Thornton family. Thomas's death changes everything." The older woman's eyes had drifted to Sarah's swollen belly with barely disguised contempt. "We can't be certain that child is even his." The accusation had stolen Sarah's breath more effectively than the bitter wind now whipping at her face. She'd been too shocked to speak, too stunned to defend herself against the lie. Thomas had been her everything, her first love, her husband, the father of her unborn child. They'd been planning their future together right until the fever took him 3 weeks ago. "I have the right to stay," she'd finally managed to whisper. "Thomas would have wanted—" "Thomas isn't here," Richard, her father-in-law, had cut in. His weathered face, once kind, had hardened into unrecognizable planes. "And we need to protect what's ours. You'll receive a small stipend, enough to—" "Start somewhere else. That's more than generous, considering." Sarah had watched in disbelief as Margaret gathered her few belongings into a carpet bag, some clothes, a hairbrush, the pocket watch Thomas had pressed into her hands the day before he died. The older woman's movements were efficient, methodical, as if she'd been planning this moment. "You can't do this," Sarah had pleaded, one hand protectively covering her belly. "The baby will come in less than 2 months, please." "Thomas would never forgive you." "Thomas was too trusting," Margaret had replied. "Always was. It was his weakness." She'd thrust the bag at Sarah. "Take it and go. There's a coach due through town tomorrow. Don't make this harder than it needs." Now, hours later, Sarah fought against the wind and her own exhaustion. The town was 5 miles away, an impossible distance in this weather. She should have stayed in the barn, waited out the storm, but pride and heartbreak had driven her into the gathering dusk. The baby kicked, a fierce reminder of why she had to survive. She pulled Thomas's watch from her pocket one more time, trying to make out the time through snow-blurred eyes. The hands had stopped moving. Like everything else in her world, it was frozen, stuck in a moment that shouldn't have been. Ahead, through the swirling white, she thought she saw a light, or maybe it was just her mind playing tricks, offering false hope as her strength failed. Sarah took another step, then another. The snow had soaked through her boots, her feet now numb blocks of ice. The shawl she wore might as well have been gossamer for all the protection it offered. Her world narrowed to the simple act of movement: lift foot, step, breathe, repeat. She couldn't feel the tears freezing on her cheeks anymore. The baby kicked, again, harder this time. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I promise I'm trying." But her legs wouldn't cooperate. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the deep snow. The light, if it had ever been real, was gone now. There was only white, endless white, and the growing urge to close her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself, just to rest. As consciousness slipped away, Sarah's fingers curled around Thomas's pocket watch. In her mind, she could hear it, ticking again, counting down the seconds until everything changed. Jack Mitchell stood at his cabin window, watching the storm gather strength. The empty rocking chair beside him creaked softly in the draught, its gentle motion a ghost of memory. Hannah used to sit there every evening, one hand resting on her rounded belly as she watched the sun set behind the mountains. Now the chair moved on its own, keeping time with the wind that howled through the valley. He turned away from both, window and chair, focusing instead on building up the fire. The routine was familiar: split wood, stack kindling, tend flames. Simple tasks that filled his days and kept his mind from wandering too far into the past. His dog Buck lay near the hearth, tail thumping against the floorboards as Jack worked. "Looks like we're in for a bad one, old friend," Jack murmured, more for the comfort of a voice breaking the silence than any need to speak. 3 years of solitude had taught him the value of sound, even if it was just his own words echoing. Off cabin walls, the horses would need checking before the storm hit full force. Jack pulled on his heavy coat, the leather worn soft with age and use. Buck rose to follow, but Jack gestured for him to stay. "Keep the fire company," he said. The dog settled back down with a soft whine of protest. Outside, the wind cut through layers of wool and leather like they were nothing. Jack made his way to the barn, where 4 horses stamped restlessly in their stalls. These animals, along with Buck, were his only company now. He checked their water, made sure they had enough hay to last the night. His hands moved automatically through the familiar tasks while his mind drifted. 3 years. Sometimes it felt like yesterday that he'd lost them, Hannah and their unborn child. Other times it seemed like a lifetime ago. The fever had taken them both in less than a week, leaving him with nothing but an empty cabin and a rocking chair that wouldn't stay still. He'd considered leaving after it happened, selling the ranch, moving somewhere without memories lurking in every corner. But in the end he'd stayed. This land was all he had left of the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned together. So he'd learned to live with the quiet, to find comfort in routine, to let the seasons pass without marking their passage too carefully. Thunder rolled across the valley, drawing Jack back to the present. He gave each horse a final pat, checked the barn door was secure. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that erased the world beyond his immediate vision. He'd have to string a guide rope from barn to cabin if this kept up. As he turned to head back, something caught his eye. A darker shape against the white void of the storm. Probably just a shadow, he told himself, or his mind playing tricks again. But Buck's earlier restlessness nagged at him. The dog, usually, had better instincts than his master. Jack squinted into the storm, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape seemed to move, or maybe that was just the snow playing tricks with his vision. Then it crumpled, like a puppet with cut strings, and Jack's body was moving before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. Someone was out there in this killing weather. Someone who had just collapsed into the deepening snow. "Hold on," he muttered, though the wind snatched the words away. "Just hold on." He wasn't sure if he was talking to the stranger or to himself, to the part of him that had grown too comfortable with solitude, too wary of anything that might disturb his carefully constructed peace. Behind him, the empty rocking chair creaked. In the cabin, marking time like a metronome, as Jack Mitchell's solitary life tipped toward inevitable change. The woman was nearly buried in snow by the time Jack reached her. Her skin held a bluish tinge that sent a spike of fear through his chest. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, finding a pulse. Weak but steady. She was alive, but wouldn't be for long in this cold. "Miss?" He touched her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" No response, but as he shifted her, he noticed the swell of her belly beneath her thin shawl. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. Pregnant. Dear God, she was pregnant and out here alone in this killing weather. Jack shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around her before lifting her into his arms. She was surprisingly light despite her condition, or maybe it was just that fear lent him strength. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her through the deepening snow, her breath coming in shallow puffs that crystallized in the frozen air. Buck was waiting at the cabin door, whining anxiously as Jack shouldered his way inside. The dog's presence was a comfort. At least he wouldn't face this crisis alone. "Get the blanket," he commanded, knowing Buck understood the word. The dog trotted to the chest by the bed, nosing at the old woolen blanket Hannah had brought from her family home. Jack laid the woman gently on the bed, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped her in the blanket. He hadn't touched another human being in 3 years, hadn't allowed anyone into this space that still held echoes of his loss. But he couldn't think about that now. This woman needed help, and he was all she had. Her clothes were soaked through. They'd have to come off if she was going to survive the night. Jack hesitated, then squared his shoulders. This wasn't about propriety. It was about survival. He worked quickly, efficiently, keeping her covered with the blanket as much as possible. As he removed her wet things, the pocket watch fell from her dress as he worked, landing with a dull thud on the wooden floor. He picked it up, noting the fine craftsmanship before setting it carefully aside. There was a story there, but it would have to wait. Once she was dry and wrapped warmly, Jack built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably hot. Buck settled beside the bed, his brown eyes fixed on their unexpected guest. Jack understood the dog's vigilance. There was something about her that called out for protection. He was checking her temperature again when her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed, deep and dark, like well water. Fear flickered across her face as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. "You're safe," Jack said quickly, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I found you in the snow. You're in my cabin now, out of the storm." She tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. Jack helped her sit up slightly, holding a cup of water to her lips. She sipped slowly, her hand coming up to cradle her belly in an unconscious gesture of protection. "The baby," her voice was barely a whisper, "seems all right. You're both warm now, and that's the main thing." He hesitated, then added, "I'm Jack Mitchell. This is my ranch." "Sarah," she managed, "Sarah Thornton." Her eyes filled suddenly with tears, though she tried to blink them away. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to impose." "No apologies needed, not in this weather." Jack stepped back, giving her space. "Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger." She nodded, her eyes already drifting closed again. Jack watched as her breathing evened out into sleep, noted how one hand still rested protectively over her unborn child. The scene stirred memories he'd thought safely buried. Hannah sleeping. In this same bed, their future full of promise and possibility. Buck pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for the anchor to the present. Whatever this woman's story was, however she'd ended up out there in the storm, those questions could wait. For now, she was safe. For now, that had to be enough. When Sarah woke again, the cabin was filled with the soft glow of lamplight. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself in this unfamiliar space. The bed was narrow but comfortable, piled with quilts that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Near the hearth, a man, Jack, she remembered, was pulling something from an old medical kit. "How long?" Her voice was stronger now, though her throat still felt raw. He turned, relief evident in his expression. "About 3 hours. Storm's getting worse." As if to emphasize his words, wind rattled the cabin windows. "Think you could manage some broth?" Sarah nodded, then tried to sit up. Her muscles protested the movement, and she couldn't quite suppress a gasp of pain. Jack was beside her instantly, supporting her with a strong arm as he arranged pillows behind her back. "Easy now," he said, his touch careful but sure. "You've had a rough time of it." He reached for the medical kit again, bringing out a small bottle. "Willow bark tincture, for the pain." She accepted the medicine gratefully, noting the precise organization of the kit's contents. Everything a person might need for emergencies, neatly arranged and well-maintained. Like the rest of the cabin, it spoke of someone who took care in small things. Buck padded over to rest his head on the bed beside her, his tail wagging gently. Sarah scratched behind his ears, finding comfort in the simple interaction. "He's beautiful," she said. "How long have you had him?" 4 years. Jack was busy at the stove, his back to her. "He was a gift from my wife." His voice held a carefully neutral tone that made Sarah's heart ache with recognition. She knew that tone, had heard it in her own voice when speaking of Thomas. The broth, when he brought it, was rich and flavorful. Sarah hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. She ate slowly, conscious of Jack's watchful presence. "The baby's been moving," she said after a while. I think we're both going to be all right." Jack nodded, though concern still creased his brow. "All the same, you should rest as much as possible. It's not good for either of you, being out in weather like that." He paused, then added carefully, "If you want to tell me how you came to be there." Sarah's hands tightened around the bowl. The memory of Margaret's cold eyes and Richard's. Her voice was still too fresh, too painful. "I will," she said, "just not yet." "Of course." He took the empty bowl, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "No need to talk until you're ready." Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, rattling windows and seeking entry through every crack and crevice. But inside, the fire burned, steady and warm. Sarah watched as Jack added another log, noting how the flames cast flickering shadows across his face. He wasn't a young man, she realized, though it was hard to guess his exact age. Life had left its marks on him, in the silver threading his dark hair and the lines around his eyes. "You should try to sleep more," he said, catching her watching him. "I'll be right here if you need anything." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. After the cruelty of the past days, it was almost too much to bear. Sarah turned her face away, not wanting him to see her tears, but a soft sob escaped despite her best efforts. She felt, rather than heard him move closer, and then a clean handkerchief appeared in her line of vision. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe here, both of you." Sarah took the handkerchief, oddly touched by this simple gesture of comfort. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it for more than just the handkerchief. "Thank you for finding us." He didn't respond directly, just adjusted the quilts around her and moved back to his chair by the fire. But in the comfort of the warm cabin, with Buck's steady presence beside her and Jack's quiet watchfulness nearby, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Hope. Morning came, with tentative streams of sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of Jack moving about the cabin. The storm had passed, but drifts of snow pressed against the window panes, transforming the world outside into something alien and white. She sat up carefully, testing her strength. The aches remained, but the bone-deep cold was gone. On the bedside table, she found Thomas's pocket watch, carefully placed where she could see it. The sight of it brought yesterday's memories flooding back. The cruel words, the long walk in the snow, the stranger who had saved her life. "Feeling stronger?" Jack's voice was quiet, careful not to startle her. "Yes, thank you." Sarah watched as he poured coffee into 2 cups. His movements were precise, practiced, the gestures of a man used to doing things for himself. "Though I'm not sure how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No repayment needed." He brought her a cup, then settled into the chair near the bed. "But I do need to ask, is there someone looking for you? Someone I should send word to?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the warm cup. "No," she said softly. "There's no one." She took a sip of coffee, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "My husband, Thomas, he died 3 weeks ago. Fever took him so quickly we barely had time to say goodbye." Jack's expression shifted, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. He rose suddenly, went to a shelf near the fireplace, and returned with a wooden box. From it, he withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft with handling. "Hannah," he said, holding out the image. "My wife. We lost her 3 years ago. Her and our unborn child." Sarah took the photograph with gentle hands. A beautiful woman smiled up at her, one hand resting on a slightly rounded belly, her face full of joy and possibility. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, understanding now why he had been so quick to help her, why he knew exactly what to do. "Fever as well," Jack continued, his voice rougher now. "Nothing I could do but watch it happen. Afterward, well, seemed easier to just stay out here, keep to myself." Sarah handed the photograph back, noting how carefully he returned it to its box. "Thomas's family," she swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome after he died. Said they couldn't be sure the baby was his, though they knew how much we loved each other. That why you were out in that storm." There was an edge to his voice now, anger on her behalf. She nodded, one hand moving protectively to her belly. "They gave me a few things and told me to leave. There's a coach that comes through town. I thought I could make it, but the storm came so quickly." "Damn fools," Jack muttered. "Could have killed you both." He stood abruptly, moved to stoke the fire. "Well, you'll stay here until the baby comes. No argument about that. It's not safe for you to travel now anyway. Roads will be blocked for weeks after a storm like this." "I couldn't impose—" "Not an imposition." He turned back to her, his expression determined. "I've got the space, and Buck could use the company. He gets tired of just me talking to him." As if hearing his name, the dog trotted over to lay his head in Sarah's lap. She scratched his ears, grateful for the simple affection. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it more than ever. Jack nodded, then went to check the windows. "Storms left us pretty well buried," he observed. "I'll need to dig out to the barn. Check on the horses. You rest. There's more broth warming on the stove when you're hungry." Sarah watched him pull on his heavy coat, saw how he checked to make sure she had everything within reach before heading out. Such simple kindnesses, yet they touched something deep inside her that she'd thought frozen by grief and betrayal. Through the frost-covered window, she could just make out Jack's figure moving through the snow toward the barn. The morning sun caught the ice crystals in the air, surrounding him with a halo of light. Behind her, the old photograph sat in its box, a reminder that sometimes the greatest understanding comes from shared pain, and healing can begin in the most unexpected places. Days settled into a gentle rhythm as Sarah's strength returned. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Jack moving quietly through the cabin, building up the fire and brewing coffee. The familiar clang of cast iron on the wood stove became a comfort, a sound she'd known from her own kitchen, now finding new life. "In this place, you don't have to cook," Jack had protested the first time she'd taken over breakfast preparations, but the look of pleasure on his face when she'd served up proper biscuits told a different story. The old cast-iron skillet responded to her touch like an eager friend, and soon the cabin was filled with smells that had been absent for too long. "Hannah loved to cook too," he said one morning, watching Sarah knead bread dough at the small table. "Used to say a house wasn't really a home until it smelled like fresh bread." "Thomas could barely boil water," Sarah replied, smiling at the memory. "But he'd sit in the kitchen and talk while I cooked, telling me about his day on the ranch." Her hands kept moving in the familiar rhythm, fold, press, turn. "I miss that, the simple things." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The quiet's the hardest part, isn't it? Even when you get used to it, it's still there." They developed an easy partnership as the days passed. Jack would handle the heavy work outside, clearing paths through the snow, caring for the horses, checking his trap lines. Sarah kept the cabin in order, cooking meals that gradually coaxed more life into the place. Buck moved between them like a happy pendulum, equally content to help Jack with his chores, or lie near Sarah as she worked. The baby grew more active, as if responding to the peace they'd found. Sometimes in the evenings, when they sat by the fire, Sarah would catch Jack watching her hand move across her belly, following the baby's movements. There was longing in his gaze, but also fear. She recognized it because she felt it too. The fear of caring too much, of losing again. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, after they'd finished a simple but satisfying supper. "The cabin's got a second room. Been using it for storage, but it wouldn't take much to clear it out, make it proper for the baby." Sarah's hands stilled in the dishwater. Jack, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. His voice was gentle but firm. I want to. That room's been waiting for a purpose. Seems right it should finally have one. They worked on it together over the next few days, sorting through years of accumulated items. Jack was methodical in his approach, carefully considering each piece before deciding its fate. Sarah understood. Every object held memories, and sorting through them was like sifting through the past itself. The work was good for them both. It gave structure to their days, purpose to their conversations. Sometimes they would stop to rest, and Jack would tell stories about the ranch's early days, or Sarah would share memories of her life before Thomas. The silences between them grew, comfortable, filled with understanding rather than grief. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows of what would become the nursery, Sarah found herself humming as she worked. The sound caught her by surprise. She hadn't sung since Thomas died, but here, in this peaceful space, with the baby moving inside her and the sounds of Jack chopping wood floating in from outside, it felt natural. She looked around the half-finished room, at the evidence of care in every corner. The rocking chair had been moved in from the main room, a gesture that had required no discussion. New curtains, made from fabric Jack had found in a trunk, hung. At the windows, and on the wall, waiting to be filled, hung a simple wooden frame that Jack had carved himself. It wasn't the future she had planned, but standing there in the warm afternoon light, Sarah realized it was a future she could embrace, one built on shared understanding, quiet strength, and the slow healing that comes from finding your way home again. The evening had settled into quiet when Sarah felt it, a kick stronger than any before, clear and purposeful. She was sitting in the rocking chair, working on a small pair of booties she'd started knitting from spare wool Jack had found. The sudden movement made her gasp. Jack looked up from where he was mending a bridle by the fire. "Everything all right?" "Yes, it's just," she smiled, pressing her hand against the spot. "The baby's very active tonight." Another kick followed, as if in response. Would you like to feel?" The invitation hung in the air between them. Jack's hands stilled on the leather, and for a moment Sarah thought she'd overstepped, but then he set the bridle aside and moved to kneel beside her chair. "You're sure?" His voice was rough with emotion. Sarah took his hand, guiding it to the spot where the baby was most active. For a few seconds there was nothing, then a solid kick pressed against his palm, and Jack's breath caught audibly. "Strong little one," he murmured, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. "Just like their mama." The baby kicked again, and Sarah watched Jack's face transform. The careful mask he usually wore softened, years falling away as wonder crept into his eyes. He stayed there, hand gentle against her belly, until the baby settled. "Hannah never got this far," he said quietly, still kneeling beside the chair. "We lost them before." He trailed off, but Sarah understood. Carefully she covered his hand with hers. "I'm scared sometimes," she admitted, "about doing this alone." "You're not alone." The words came quickly, with a certainty that warmed her heart. "Not anymore." They stayed like that for a moment longer, connected by touch and shared understanding. Then Jack cleared his throat and stood, moving back to his work by the fire. But something had shifted between them, a new level of trust established. Sarah returned to her knitting, the half-finished booty taking shape in her hands. She'd learned, from her mother, years ago, how to work the soft wool into these tiny garments. The familiar motions were soothing, a link to her past that felt right in this new present. "My mother had a saying," she said after a while, holding up the booty to check her progress. "Every stitch is a prayer for the little one to come." Jack looked up, a slight smile touching his lips. "Wise woman? Your mother?" "She was." Sarah started on the second booty, needles clicking softly. "She would have loved Thomas, and she would have stood up to his family if she were still here." "Tell me about her." Jack's request was gentle, offering her the chance to share or stay silent as she chose. Sarah knitted another row, gathering her thoughts. She was strong but gentle with it, could birth a calf in the morning and serve tea from her best china that afternoon, never saw the point in putting on airs, but believed in the dignity of doing things well. As she talked, her hands kept moving, working the wool into something new and hopeful. Outside, snow began falling again, but softly now. Not the brutal storm that had brought her here, but the kind that blankets the world in quiet beauty. She taught me about herbs, about healing, said a woman should know how to take care of her own. Sarah paused, remembering. When she died, I thought I'd never feel whole again, but then I met Thomas and he helped me find my way back to joy. And now, Jack's question was barely above a whisper. Sarah looked down at the finished booties, so small in her hands. Now, I'm learning that the heart has room for both grief and hope, that maybe the best way to honor those we've lost is to keep living, keep loving. The baby moved again, gentler this time, like a reminder of life's persistence. Sarah set the booties aside and rocked slowly, watching the fire paint shadows on the cabin walls. Across the room, Jack had returned to his mending, but there was an ease to his movements that hadn't been there before. They were learning, both of them, how to build something new from the ashes of their past. February arrived with bitter determination, bringing the coldest days anyone could remember. Each morning, Jack checked the firewood pile with growing concern. They had enough for now, but if the winter stretched much longer, they'd need to find more. The nearest stand of suitable trees was half a mile away, a challenging distance in. The deep snow, especially with Sarah's condition advancing. We'll need to be more careful with the wood, he announced one morning, returning from his daily check. Might have to close off the back room, keep to just the main space. Sarah looked up from where she was preserving the last of their apples, her hands sticky with honey. What about the nursery? We'll keep that warm. Jack's tone left no room for argument. But the rest, he gestured to the dwindling woodpile visible through the window. We have to think ahead. They developed new routines to conserve their resources. During the day, they stayed in the main room, Sarah working near the windows to catch the natural light, while Jack repaired tools and tack. At night, they would bank the fire carefully, making sure every bit of heat was preserved. I've never seen it this cold, Sarah said one evening, watching frost patterns grow across the window panes. Even the birds have gone quiet. Jack nodded, adding another precious log to the fire. Makes me worry about the horses. Been giving them extra feed, but they're struggling with it too. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter, one hand resting on her growing belly. How long do these winters usually last? Hard to say. Could break next week, could go on another month. He didn't add what they both knew, that they might not have enough supplies for another month. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Jack preparing for a journey. He was checking his rifle, packing supplies into his saddlebags with methodical care. There's a trading post about 15 miles south, he explained before she could ask. Might have some supplies we can use. Whatever happens, we need more ammunition for hunting. 15 miles in this weather? Sarah couldn't keep the worry from her voice. Jack, that's too dangerous. More dangerous to wait until we're desperate. He continued his preparations, though his movements were gentler now, responding to her concern. I'll take Buck with me. We should be back by nightfall. Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Their situation wasn't critical yet, but it could become so quickly. Still, the thought of him out there alone made her heart clench with familiar fear. Promise me you'll be careful, she said, pressing something into his hand. It was one of the baby's booties she'd knitted. For luck. Jack stared at the tiny garment for a long moment before tucking it carefully into his coat pocket. I'll come back, he said simply. I promise. She watched from the window as he rode out, Buck bounding through the snow beside him. The morning sun caught the ice crystals in the air, creating halos of light that seemed to follow them until they disappeared into the white distance. The day stretched endlessly. Sarah kept busy, banking the fire, checking their supplies, anything to keep her mind from wandering to dark possibilities. She knew too well how quickly things could go wrong, how a simple journey could end in tragedy. As dusk approached with no sign of Jack's return, she found herself in the rocking chair, one hand pressed to her belly, while the other clutched Thomas's pocket watch. The baby was active, as if sensing her anxiety. "He'll come back," she whispered. Though whether she was reassuring the baby or herself, she wasn't sure. Just when the last light was fading, she heard Buck's familiar bark. Sarah hurried to the door, relief flooding through her as she made out two shapes emerging from the gathering darkness. Jack's face was wind-burned, his clothes covered in snow, but his eyes were bright with triumph. "Found more than supplies," he announced, holding up a bag. "Got word into town, too. Doc Jenkins says he'll try to make it out here when it's time." Sarah helped him unload his saddlebags, noting with relief the ammunition, medical supplies, and other necessities he'd managed to obtain. But it was the way he kept his hand in his pocket, where she knew the tiny booty rested, that touched her most deeply. That night, with the fire burning bright and their immediate fears eased, Sarah realized something had shifted again. This cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was becoming a home, built on trust, shared courage, and the quiet understanding that grew stronger with each passing day. The night Sarah fell, Jack was in the barn. She'd insisted on helping with the evening chores, restless after being confined indoors for so long. The path to the barn was well packed, and she'd made the trip several times that week without incident. But this time, carrying a lantern back to the cabin, her foot found a patch of ice. The lantern shattered as she fell, glass tinkling across the frozen ground. Her cry brought Buck racing from the barn, barking frantically. Inside, Jack's head snapped up at the sound. He found her trying to stand, one hand pressed against her belly, face white with pain. The broken lantern lay beside her, its light extinguished like a snuffed candle. "Don't move," he ordered, heart pounding as he knelt beside her. "Tell me where it hurts." "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong." Fresh pain crossed her face, and she clutched at his arm. "Jack, please!" He lifted her carefully, cursing himself for letting her help with chores, for not insisting she stay inside where it was safe. She felt too light in his arms, despite her advanced pregnancy, and her breath came in short, frightened gasps. Inside the cabin, he laid her gently on the bed. "I need to check the baby," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his fear. "Will you let me?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Jack's hands were gentle as he felt her belly, remembering what Hannah's doctor had shown him during her pregnancy. The baby moved under his touch. A good sign, he thought with relief. "Talk to me," he urged, continuing his examination. "Any sharp pains? Or more like pressure?" "Pressure," she managed. "And my back—" She broke off with a grimace. Jack reached for the medical kit, hands steady now that he had a task to focus on. "I think the baby's just unsettled from the fall. But we need to keep you still for a while. Make sure everything stays calm." He helped her drink some water, then began brewing the willow bark tea that had become a staple of their medical supplies. Sarah's color was better now, her breathing easier, though fear still lingered in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have been more careful." "Nothing to be sorry for." Jack pulled a chair close to the bed. "Though you might have to put up with me hovering more now." A weak smile touched her lips. "Like you weren't hovering before?" "Fair point." He checked her pulse again, relieved to find it stronger. "But you're stuck with it now, no arguments." Buck had settled on the floor beside the bed, his chin resting on the mattress near Sarah's hand. The dog's presence seemed to comfort her, and her fingers tangled in his fur as another wave of discomfort passed. Through the long night, Jack kept watch. He tended the fire, made fresh tea, and listened to Sarah's breathing even out into sleep. Every so often he would check her temperature, his touch careful not to wake her. Dawn found them both exhausted but relieved. The baby had settled, moving with normal vigor, and Sarah's pain had eased to a dull ache. Jack helped her sit up, adjusting pillows behind her back. "You gave me quite a scare," he admitted, pouring her a cup of fresh tea. Sarah accepted the cup, her hands steady now. "I scared myself." She met his eyes. "Thank you." for knowing what to do, for staying. Where else would I be? The words came without thought, simple truth in them. Later that morning, Jack went out to clear away the broken lantern. He gathered each piece carefully, not wanting to leave any glass that might cause future harm. The metal frame was bent, but salvageable. Like them, he thought, damaged by life, but not beyond repair. When he returned inside, Sarah was dozing in the rocking chair, one hand resting protectively over her belly. The morning sun caught her face, highlighting the piece there, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. The fear of caring, of losing, again was still there, but it was becoming less important than the fear of not caring enough. He stoked the fire and settled in his chair nearby, ready to watch over them both for as long as they needed. March arrived with subtle changes, longer days, softer winds, and the gradual drip of melting icicles outside the cabin windows. Sarah noticed it first one morning, a different quality to the light that streamed across the wooden floor. "Spring's coming," she said, pausing in her bread-making to watch a drop of water fall from the eaves. Her hands were dusted with flour, her movements slower now with the weight of the baby. Jack looked up from where he was repairing a chair leg. Snow's still deep, but different. She smiled, remembering something. Thomas used to say you could smell spring before you could see it. The mention of Thomas's name came easily now, no longer carrying the sharp edge of fresh grief. Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. They'd both learned how to carry their memories more gently. That afternoon, Jack came in from checking the horses with something cupped carefully in his hand. "Found this by the south wall," he said, holding out a tiny purple crocus pushing through the melting snow. "Thought you might like to see it." Sarah took the delicate flower, touching its petals with wonder. "First one of the season." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "We should press it, save it for the baby's book." They'd started the book together during the long winter evenings. A simple leather-bound journal where Sarah recorded her hopes for the child, and Jack sometimes added small sketches of the ranch and its animals. The pressed flower would be perfect for its pages. "Been thinking," Jack said, watching her arrange the crocus between sheets of paper. "When the road's clear, you'll have choices to make." Sarah's hands stilled. They hadn't spoken of the future, both content to let winter hold them in its suspended moment. But spring brought questions that needed answering. "The town's growing," he continued, his voice carefully neutral. "You could find work there, make a life for yourself and the little one." "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked quietly, not looking up from the flower. "Want?" Jack moved to the window, staring out at the melting landscape. "What I want stopped mattering when Hannah died, or I thought it did. And now—" He turned back to her, his face softened by the spring light. "Now I'm not so sure." He paused, choosing his words with care. "This cabin's too quiet when you're not in it." Sarah felt the baby move, a gentle flutter like hope taking wing. "Then maybe we don't need to make any decisions just yet." "No," Jack agreed, relief evident in his voice. "Maybe we don't." The days lengthened, bringing more signs of spring's approach. The snow retreated gradually, revealing patches of earth that had slept hidden all winter. Jack began preparations for calving season, making repairs to the corrals and checking his supplies. Sarah watched him work from the cabin porch, where she'd taken to sitting in the strengthening sunlight. Her time was growing closer too, the baby more active now, responding to the changing season. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she felt brave enough to ask, "Do you ever regret finding me that night?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, stoking the flames. "Only regret would have been not finding you," he finally said. Some things are meant to happen, even if we don't understand why at first." Sarah thought about the crocus, pushing through frozen ground to find the light, about how life persisted, even in the hardest places, about how love could grow again, different but no less real. "When I lost Thomas," she said softly, "I thought that was the end of my story, but maybe it was just the end of one chapter." Jack reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and sure. They sat together in comfortable, Silence, watching the fire dance and listening to the sound of spring water running beneath the melting snow. The sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful spring morning. Jack heard them first, straightening from his work in the garden patch he'd been preparing. Sarah was on the porch, folding newly washed linens, when she saw his expression change. "Stay inside," he said quietly, helping her to her feet. There was a protective edge to his voice that made her heart race. Buck with her. Sarah watched through the window as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Even at this distance, she recognized the rigid set of Margaret Thornton's shoulders, the way Richard sat his horse like he owned the world. The 3rd rider was there. Lawyer Mr. Peterson, his black coat stark against the melting snow. Buck pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. Sarah's hands went instinctively to her belly, now full enough that there could be no doubt about her condition. "Mrs. Thornton," Jack's voice carried clearly. "This is private property." Margaret dismounted, pulling a document from her saddlebag. "We're here about our grandchild," she announced, as if pronouncing a royal decree. "We have papers." Sarah moved to the door, despite Jack's earlier warning. She needed to face this, to face them. The morning sun caught the silver in Margaret's hair, reminding Sarah of happier times when she'd thought this woman might become like a mother to her. "The child isn't yours," Sarah said, stepping onto the porch. Jack moved immediately to stand. Between her and the visitors, his presence solid and reassuring. "According to these," Mr. Peterson held up the papers, "the Thorntons have legal claim to any child of their son's marriage. Given the circumstances of your departure, Mrs. Thornton, and certain questions about the child's paternity, that's enough." Jack's voice was quiet but carried an authority that made the lawyer fall silent. "I suggest you leave. Now." Richard Thornton stepped forward. "We have the law on our side, sir, and the means to enforce it." He looked past Jack to Sarah. "Did you think we wouldn't find you? That we'd let Thomas's child be raised by strangers?" "Strangers." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You made me a stranger when you cast me out in winter, when you accused me of—" Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Thomas was my husband. I loved him. This child is mine. The courts will decide that," Margaret said coldly. She held out the document. "These papers require you to return with us to town, where you'll remain under our supervision until the birth." Jack hadn't moved, hadn't taken the papers. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his tone measured, "I'm sure you know Doc Jenkins. Good man, honest man. He's been out here twice now, checking on Sarah and the baby. I imagine he'd have something to say about your accusations." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. The doctor was indeed well respected, his word carrying weight in the community. "Furthermore," Jack continued, "I've sent word to Judge Wilson about Sarah's situation. He's expecting us next week to file our own papers." This was news to Sarah, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Now, I suggest you take your documents and leave my property." "Your property?" Richard's voice rose. "And what claim do you have on any of this?" "The claim of basic human decency," Jack replied. "Something you might want to consider." He stepped forward, his voice dropping so only they could hear. "You cast out a pregnant woman in winter, left her to die in the snow. You really want that story getting around town?" The threat hung in the air like frost. Sarah watched as Margaret's rigid posture faltered slightly. The older woman looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since arriving. "You would have let me die," Sarah said softly. "Both of us. Jack saved us." She straightened, finding strength in the truth. "This is my home now. My choice." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should reconsider our position, given the circumstances." "Given nothing," Richard started, but Margaret laid a hand on his arm. "We've lost enough," she said quietly. "Thomas wouldn't want this." The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Then Richard turned his horse, his anger evident in every line of his body. Margaret hesitated, looking once more at Sarah. "The baby," she said, her voice softer now. Will you let us know?" Sarah felt Jack's solid presence beside her, supporting whatever choice she made. "If you come in peace," she answered, "you'll be welcome, but only in peace." They watched the three riders depart, the legal papers still untouched in Mr. Peterson's saddlebag. Only when they disappeared into the trees did Sarah let herself shake, let the tears come. Jack's arms were around her instantly, strong and sure. "It's over," he murmured. "They won't be back. Not like that." Sarah pressed her face into his shirt, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Buck whined softly, nudging at their joined hands, and Sarah felt the baby move, as if responding to the end of danger. They stood together on the porch, a family forged in winter's trial, now standing firm in spring's promise. The trip to town took longer than usual, the wagon moving carefully over the muddy spring roads. Jack had insisted on bringing fresh straw and extra blankets to make Sarah comfortable, though she assured him she was fine. "First time I've left the ranch since—" She didn't need to finish. They both remembered that snowy night. The town had grown even in those few months. New buildings stretched along the main street, and the sound of construction rang from several directions. Sarah felt exposed under the curious gazes of passers-by, but Jack's steady presence beside her kept her grounded. Judge Wilson's office was above the general store, a tiny space that smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. The old judge listened carefully as they explained their situation, his weathered face giving nothing away. "Got the deed right here," Jack said finally, pulling out the carefully preserved document. "Want to make some changes to it." Sarah looked at him in surprise. They hadn't discussed this. The judge examined the deed, then glanced between them. "What kind of changes?" "Want to add Sarah's name," Jack said simply. "Make it legal and proper. She's made this place a home again. Should be hers too." Sarah's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a rush. "Jack, you can't—" "Can and will." He turned to her, his eyes soft but determined. "If you'll accept it." The judge cleared his throat. Miss Thornton would need to be free to enter such an arrangement, given her previous marriage. "Got that covered too." Jack produced another document, a letter from Doc Jenkins testifying to Sarah's character and condition, and another from Reverend Blake supporting her claim to independence. "You've been busy," Sarah whispered, touching his arm. "Had to make sure everything was right and proper." He covered her hand with his. "No one's going to threaten you or the little one again. Not while I'm breathing." The judge watched this exchange with keen eyes. "There'll be talk," he warned. "People wondering about arrangements, about propriety." "Let them talk," Sarah said firmly. "I know what's right, what's true." Something like approval flickered across the judge's face. He pulled out fresh papers, his pen scratching quietly as he worked. While he wrote, Sarah noticed other changes in the office since her last visit with Thomas. New curtains at the window, a collection of law books that hadn't been there before. Life moved forward, always changing, always growing. "Need witnesses," the judge said finally. But as it happens, he moved to the window and called down to the street. Moments later, Doc Jenkins and Reverend Blake appeared, as if this had all been arranged. Sarah looked at Jack, who shrugged slightly. "Wanted to be prepared," he said, "for whatever you decided." The signing was simple but profound. Sarah watched as her name was added to the deed, making official what her heart had known for weeks. This was home, not just the ranch, but the life they were building together. "There's one more thing," Jack said when the witnesses had gone. He pulled out a small box, worn with age. Inside was a ring, simple but beautiful. "Belonged to my mother. Don't have to wear it if you don't want to, but—" He took a deep breath. "Would you consider making this arrangement permanent? Proper marriage when you're ready?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed in grief. These were tears of hope, of joy found again in unexpected places. "Already made up my mind about that," she said softly. "Just been waiting for you to ask." The judge tactfully busied himself with his papers as Jack slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, another piece of their shared story falling into place. Outside, spring sunshine warmed the muddy Streets. Sarah heard children laughing somewhere nearby, smelled fresh bread from the bakery, felt the baby move within her. All signs of life continuing, growing, finding new paths. "Ready to head home?" Jack asked, helping her into the wagon. Home. Such a simple word for such a profound truth. Sarah touched the ring on her finger, thought of the deed with both their names. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." The baby came, with the first real dawn of summer. Sarah woke to early contractions, watching sunlight creep across the cradle Jack had carved during the final weeks of waiting. Its simple lines and smooth curves spoke of hours of patient work, of love shaped by careful hands. "It's time," she told Jack when he brought her morning tea. He set the cup down with shaking hands, but his voice was steady. "I'll send Buck for Doc Jenkins." They'd arranged this signal weeks ago, a message tied to the dog's collar, and Buck knew the way. Jack knelt beside the bed, taking her hand. "Want me to stay until he comes?" Sarah squeezed his fingers as another contraction built. "No, there's time yet. Take care of what needs doing. This little one won't rush." The day unfolded slowly, measured in breaths and steps and moments of grace. Jack moved between tasks with careful efficiency, keeping water hot, preparing clean linens, making sure everything was ready. Each time he checked on her, his touch was gentle, his presence a comfort. Doc Jenkins arrived by mid-morning, his bag heavy with supplies. "Well now," he said, taking in Sarah's calm face and Jack's barely contained anxiety. "Looks like we're having ourselves a baby." The labor progressed steadily as the sun climbed higher. Sarah walked when she could, rested when she needed to, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings of the cabin that had become her sanctuary. Jack stayed close, supporting her through each contraction, his solid presence anchoring her to the moment. "You're doing fine," Doc Jenkins assured them both. "Baby's positioned well. Won't be long now." Sarah gripped Jack's hand as another pain peaked. "Tell me a story," she gasped. "Anything, just help me focus." Jack cleared his throat. "Been thinking about names," he said softly. "If it's a boy," thought maybe Thomas, to honor his father. He waited for her reaction, continuing when she nodded. "And if it's a girl, Hannah, if you wouldn't mind." Tears mixed with sweat on Sarah's face. "Perfect," she whispered. "Either way, both names, both memories, part of who we are." The sun was setting when the final stage began. Sarah's world narrowed to breath and push and rest, to Jack's voice encouraging her, to the doctor's calm instructions. The carved cradle waited in the corner, its shadow long in the evening light. Then suddenly a new cry filled the cabin, strong and clear and full of life. "A girl," Doc Jenkins announced, laying the tiny bundle on Sarah's chest. "And a fine, healthy one at that." Sarah stared in wonder at her daughter's face, seeing echoes of Thomas in the curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes. But when those eyes opened, they were uniquely her own, bright and new and full of possibilities. "Hannah," she whispered. Hannah rose. She looked up at Jack, who was watching them both with tears tracking unashamedly down his face. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" His hands were sure and strong as he took the baby, cradling her with infinite care. "Welcome home, little one," he murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Doc Jenkins busied himself with final checks and preparations, giving them this moment of privacy. Buck lay guard at the door, his tail thumping softly against the floorboards. Later, when Sarah had been made comfortable and the baby lay sleeping in her carved cradle, Jack sat beside them both. The evening light painted everything in soft gold, making the moment feel somehow suspended, precious. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, touching his hand, "for everything. For finding us that night, for making room in your life, for loving her. Already, thank you for bringing life back to this place." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "For helping me remember how to love." They watched their daughter sleep, her tiny hands curled into fists, her face peaceful. In her, they could both see the traces of those they'd lost. Thomas's strength, Hannah's grace, but also something entirely new. She was a bridge between past and future, a promise of joy restored. "Sleep now," Jack said, pressing a kiss to Sarah's forehead. "I'll watch over you both." Sarah drifted off to the sound of his quiet breathing, the baby's soft sighs, the familiar creaks of the cabin settling for the night. Her last conscious thought was of the cradle, waiting all these years to hold this moment, this miracle, this new beginning. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of summer morning that made everything feel possible. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching Jack in the garden with baby Hannah strapped to his chest in a sling she'd made. He was pointing out different plants to her, his voice a low murmur of love and learning, though the baby was far too young to understand. The simple gold band sat in its box on the dresser, waiting. They'd chosen to marry here at the ranch rather than in town, with just a few witnesses to share their joy. Doc Jenkins would give her away, a role he'd claimed with tearful pleasure. When they'd asked, "Your father would be proud," he'd told her. "Thomas, too. They'd want you to find happiness again." Sarah smoothed her dress, not white, but a soft blue that matched the summer sky. Her fingers traced the careful mending where she'd let it out to accommodate the changes motherhood had brought to her body. Each stitch told a story of survival, of growth, of love found in unexpected places. Reverend Blake arrived first, his wife carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread and summer berries. Then came Doc Jenkins and his family, their children running to play with Buck while the adults helped with final preparations. Jack disappeared briefly, returning in his best shirt. Hannah now dressed in a tiny gown that Sarah had made from one of her old dresses. The baby's dark eyes were bright with interest as the small group gathered in the garden. "Never seen a prettier spot for a wedding," Reverend Blake declared, standing before the rosebush Sarah had planted in spring. Its first blooms opened around them like nature's blessing. The ceremony was simple but profound. Sarah felt the weight of all their collective joy and grief as Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, his mother's ring, now polished bright for its new purpose. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Hannah let out a happy gurgle that made everyone laugh. They shared a meal afterward, spread on tables in the shade of the old oak tree. Children played tag while the adults talked and laughed, and Sarah watched Jack move among their guests with easy grace, their daughter secure in his arms. "You've brought life back to him," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, following Sarah's gaze, "to this whole place." "He saved us," Sarah replied, "in every way possible. Seems to me you saved each other." Later, when the guests had gone, and Hannah was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Jack found Sarah standing on the porch. The evening air was sweet with summer flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. "Having any regrets?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist. Sarah leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his chest. "Only that we didn't do this sooner. Needed time," he said, understanding as always. "Both of us, to heal, to be ready." She turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become as necessary to her as breathing. "I love you," she said simply, "not despite our past, but because of it. Because you understand loss and hope and starting over." Jack's kiss was gentle, full of promise. "We've got time now," he murmured. "All the time we need." Inside, Hannah made a small sound in her sleep. They moved together to check on her, standing over the carved cradle that had waited so long to serve its purpose. Their daughter's face was peaceful, one tiny hand curled around the edge of her blanket. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah said softly, "if they can see us. Thomas and Hannah, if they know." "They know," Jack's voice was sure. "They gave us the courage to find each other, to build something new from the ashes of what we lost." Sarah touched her wedding ring, feeling the smooth metal warm against her skin. Outside, the summer night deepened into velvet darkness lit by stars. Inside, their small family was complete, not replacing what was lost, but building something new and precious from the foundations of love and understanding. "Dance with me?" Jack asked suddenly, holding out his hand. There was no music except the chirp of crickets and the soft breathing of their sleeping child. But Sarah stepped into his arms without hesitation. They moved together in the lamplight, two souls who had found their way through grief to joy, through winter to summer, through loneliness to love. The traveling photographer arrived in late summer, his wagon full of mysterious equipment and promises of memories preserved. Jack had been hesitant at first. Portraits weren't cheap, and he'd never been one for such things. But Sarah had seen how he looked at the old photograph of Hannah, knew the value of having such memories captured. "For Hannah rose," she'd said simply, "so she'll always know her family's story." Now they stood in their Sunday best, the baby dressed in white, her dark eyes curious about all the fuss. The photographer adjusted his equipment, ducking beneath the black cloth to peer through his lens. "The light's perfect," he declared. "Now, if you'll just—" He moved them with gentle precision, positioning Jack slightly behind Sarah's chair, one hand resting on her shoulder. Hannah sat contentedly in Sarah's lap, fascinated by the shiny apparatus before her. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed. "Think about something that makes you happy." Sarah felt Jack's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder. She didn't need to think about happiness. It was there in every breath, every moment, in the way Hannah's weight felt in her arms, in the sound of Jack's boots on the porch steps, in the life they'd built together. The flash powder popped and smoked, making Hannah jump slightly, but she didn't cry, just reached up toward her father with complete trust. Jack scooped her up, his face softening in that way it always did when he held their daughter. "You've got yourselves a beautiful family," the photographer said, beginning to pack up his equipment. "I'll have the portrait ready in 2 weeks." Later, after he'd gone, they sat together on the porch swing Jack had built in spring. Hannah dozed against Sarah's chest, while Jack gently rocked them, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "A family, a future worth planning for." Sarah touched the locket at her throat, a gift from Jack that held 2 tiny photographs, one of Thomas and one of the first Hannah. "They're part of that future too," she said. "Part of who we are, who Hannah will know herself to be." Jack nodded, understanding as always. They'd chosen to be honest about their past, to honor those they'd lost while celebrating what they'd found. The original photographs of Thomas and Hannah now hung beside their wedding portrait in the parlor, a visual reminder of how love could grow from loss. Hannah stirred, making the soft, snuffling sounds that meant she was hungry. Sarah adjusted her position, the familiar motions of motherhood now as natural as breathing. Jack watched them with quiet joy, his face peaceful in the gathering dusk. "Margaret sent another letter," Sarah said after a while, "asking to visit when harvest is done. What do you think?" Jack's voice was careful, leaving the choice to her. "I think—" Sarah looked down at their daughter, seeing hints of the Thornton features in her small face. "I think Hannah deserves to know all of her family. The past doesn't have to poison the future." Jack pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Mitchell." The name still gave Sarah a warm glow of pleasure. She'd kept Thornton as a middle name, honoring what was past while embracing what was present. Like the photographs on their wall, it was a bridge between then and now, a reminder that hearts could heal and grow. When the portrait finally arrived, they hung it in pride of place, not replacing the older photographs, but joining them in telling their family's complete story. In the image, they looked exactly as they were, a family built on understanding, strengthened by shared grief, and transformed by love. That night, as moonlight silvered the cabin's windows and their daughter slept peacefully in her cradle, Sarah and Jack stood arm in arm, looking at their collected photographs. Each one represented a chapter in their story: loss, discovery, healing, joy. Together they told the truth of how love could survive winter's darkest night to bloom again in summer's golden light. 1 year to the day after Sarah had stumbled through the snow, Jack stood at the entrance to their property, hammering the final nail into the new ranch sign. Mitchell Family Ranch, It read in clear carved letters. Below, in smaller script, Est, 1872, the year they'd found each other. Sarah watched from the wagon, Hannah sleeping against her chest in the warm autumn sunlight. The ranch had prospered over the past year, their hard work bearing fruit in expanded herds and fertile fields. But the true harvest was in the peace they'd found, the family they'd built. "What do you think?" Jack stepped back, admiring his handiwork. "It's perfect," Sarah said, meaning more than just the sign, "though you might need to make it bigger soon." Jack turned to her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Are you saying—" She nodded, joy bubbling up at his expression. "Doc Jenkins confirmed it yesterday. Spring will bring us another little one." Jack crossed to the wagon in 3 long strides, gathering her and Hannah both in his arms. The baby woke with a happy gurgle, reaching for her father's familiar face. "Guess we'll need that cradle again," he said, voice rough with emotion. "And this time we'll fill it together from the start." Sarah touched his cheek, feeling the moisture there. "No more ghosts between us, just memories that make us stronger." They drove up to the house together, the new sign marking more than just their property. It was a declaration of permanence, of legacy, of future. Buck raced to meet them, grey now around his muzzle, but still eager in his greetings. Inside, the cabin had evolved with their growing family. Jack's craftsmanship showed in the expanded kitchen. The new shelves filled with Sarah's preserves, the rocking chair now accompanied by a matching one he'd made over winter. Margaret and Richard Thornton had visited last harvest, as promised. The meeting had been awkward at first, weighted with past hurts, but Hannah's innocent joy had bridged many gaps, and Sarah had seen real regret in Margaret's eyes when she spoke of that winter night. "We were wrong," the older woman had said simply, watching Hannah play on the floor. "Fear and grief made us cruel. Can you ever forgive us?" Sarah had thought of her own journey, of how loss could blind you to love's new possibilities. "We can try," she'd answered, "for Hannah's sake, for all our sakes." Now, as Jack built up the fire and Sarah prepared their evening meal, Hannah practiced her new walking skills between them, sturdy legs carrying her from father to mother and back again. The cabin rang with her laughter, with the comfortable sounds of family life. "I've been thinking," Jack said as they sat down to supper, "about expanding the ranch. The Matthews place to the north is for sale. Good grazing land." Sarah nodded, understanding his vision. "Room to grow. Room for our children to build their own dreams someday." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "If you think it's a good idea." "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that Thomas and Hannah would be proud of what we've built here, of how we've honored their memory by choosing life, by choosing love." Jack squeezed her fingers. "They led us to each other. Somehow." Hannah chose that moment to drop her spoon with a clatter, then laughed delightedly at the sound. They both turned to her, sharing in her simple joy. She had Thomas's smile, they'd noticed, but her laugh was entirely her own, free and bright and full of promise. Later, after Hannah was asleep and the evening chores were done, they stood together on the porch. The autumn air was crisp with coming frost, but Sarah felt only warmth as Jack's arms encircled her, one hand resting protectively over her still flat belly. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. Below, the new ranch sign caught moonlight on its fresh carved letters. And all around them, the land stretched wide and welcoming, ready to support whatever dreams they dared to build. Winter returned, but this time there was no fear in its approach. The cabin stood warm and welcoming against the gathering cold, smoke curling from the chimney like a promise of shelter kept. Inside, Sarah sat in her rocking chair, watching Hannah take careful steps in her first pair of real boots, tiny things Jack had ordered special from the cobbler in town. "She's going to be a ranch girl through and through," Jack said proudly, steadying their daughter as she navigated the wooden floors. The boots made soft scuffing sounds, marking each determined step. Sarah smoothed a hand over her growing belly, feeling their second child move beneath her touch. Just like her sister will be. They'd learned last week they were having another girl. Doc Jenkins had smiled broadly at the news, declaring that strong women were exactly what the territory needed. Jack had immediately begun planning a second cradle, though this one would be a joint project. Sarah's growing skill with woodcarving, adding her own touches to the design. Hannah reached the window and pointed outside, where snow was beginning to fall. "Snow!" she announced clearly. One of her first words, appropriately enough for a child born to their winter-forged love. "That's right, darling," Sarah said. "But we're safe and warm in here." The word safe caught in her throat for a moment, remembering that desperate night a year and a half ago. Jack must have caught her expression, because he crossed to her chair, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No more lost souls in our storms," he said softly. "I ride the boundaries every evening now. You know that." She covered his hand with hers. "I know. My protective man." They had indeed become a shelter for others. Just last month, they'd taken in a young widow and her son, giving them work and a place in the bunkhouse until they could get back on their feet. The woman now helped Sarah with the household accounts, while her boy showed a natural way with horses that had Jack thinking of apprenticeship. "Mama!" Hannah called, having conquered the length of the room in her new boots. She held up her arms in triumph, and Sarah felt her heart swell with love for this child who carried the best of all their pasts in her tiny frame. "Well done, sweet girl." Jack swept her up, boots and all, and settled her in Sarah's lap. Hannah immediately pressed her ear to Sarah's belly, listening for her sister, a new habit that never failed to make them smile. "Baby," she said contentedly, patting the rounded surface. "That's right," Sarah smoothed her daughter's dark curls. "Your sister's in there, growing strong just like you did." Through the window they could see Buck leading the young ranch hand on evening rounds, both figures dark against the snow. The dog had taken to his teaching role with the same dedication he brought to everything, showing the boy all the important checks, just as he'd once shown Jack. "Think spring will bring more changes," Jack said, building up the fire against the growing cold. "Town's expanding again. We'll need to think about a proper schoolroom soon, not just lessons at the kitchen table." Sarah nodded. They'd already discussed creating a small schoolhouse that could serve both their growing family and the children of their workers. Another way of building community, of turning their sanctuary into something larger than themselves. Hannah's boots made a hollow sound against the floor as she slid down to resume her explorations. The leather would scuff soon enough, marking each adventure, each discovery. But for now they were pristine, like the fresh snow outside, full of possibility. "I found Thomas's pocket watch yesterday," Sarah said quietly, "when I was sorting through the trunk. Hannah wanted to know all about it." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That she had two fathers who loved her, one who gave her life and one who helped her live it." She met Jack's eyes. "Just like she has two mothers watching over her." Jack knelt beside the rocking chair, one hand on her belly while the other got Hannah as she toddled past. "Full circle," he said softly, "from that winter night to this one, from loss to love to legacy." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny miracle of transformation. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady, casting golden light over their family tableau. Hannah's boots left small prints on the floor as she moved between them, marking her path like memories made visible. And in that moment, surrounded by the love they'd built from winter's darkest hour, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this was more than survival. It was triumph. It was joy. It was home.